The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again, another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and boy, we're talking more historical baseball today. We're going back in the time machine to the 1830s, 1840s, with the origins of how baseball was created, how it was played, where it came from, and we're going to clear up a few points here about who really should be what I call, and what a lot of historians call, the father of modern baseball. And we have Marjorie Adams on the show today, who is the great-granddaughter of Doc Adams. And if you don't know who Doc Adams was, you're going to follow this podcast very carefully because it's an educational podcast we're doing on Doc. We're going to clear up a lot of nuances about Doubleday and Cartwright and a couple of other folks who might have pioneered the game. And we're going to see the role and importance of Doc Adams, who did, by the way, try to get into the Hall of Fame 2 years ago. I think the voting was 10-6. Doc missed it by 2 votes. But we're lobbying again, and I've lobbied for Doc ever since I knew about Doc Adams, but I really didn't know about Doc Adams really until Marjorie brought it to light. I mean, I knew that he was one of the pioneers of the New York Knickerbockers in the 1840s. It's a fascinating story. Stay tuned. But first, as always, you are listening to me, and I'm on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho. And folks, we got some great shows here. We got so many shows that try to educate you folks. We got Bill Cachetis in Philadelphia doing Phillies ball and athletics ball and Negro League ball, all from that great city of Philadelphia. We got Eldon Ham up in Chicago doing the White Sox and Cubs thing. We got Ralph, and we got so many shows on California. We got Giants baseball. We got Nancy Finley, niece of Charlie O and those swinging A's of the 70s. She's doing Oakland A's baseball. We got Hal Bach doing vintage sports with the Zigzag Man. Of course, we got Peter Golenbach with Golenbach University, where, every time you want to go learn something, he's the man. I mean, he's written over 50 books, mainly on my New York Yankees. There's so many shows on the network. Mark and Mark in the midday. You got Mark Littell, Mark Weiss. It's just an amazing network. I'm honored to be on the network. As most of you know, I've been writing a book, which soon, hopefully, I'll be publishing, and a few publishing companies are interested in it. And, of course, it takes place during the post-dead ball era between Tris Speaker, Ty Cobb, that whole Dutch Leonard scandal of 1926. And what leads us to that moment in sports with the dead ball and the birth of the live ball has to be traced back into a period of time in history where baseball was in its infancy before the Civil War. We're going to talk about this with Marjorie, and of course Marjorie is the great-granddaughter of Doc Adams. And every time I'm around Marjorie, and I've seen Marjorie 2 times, I believe, we meet somewhere in Rhode Island because she's a Connecticut girl out there, and I'm a Massachusetts kind of guy up here, and we meet in the middle. And I feel like I'm around baseball royalty when I'm with her because it's just an amazing experience to understand what this lady has gone for, the research that she's done, the lobbying she's doing, and the support she's getting, more important, for her great-grandfather, who did indeed, should be called the father of baseball. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Marjorie. How are you today?
I'm great, thanks, Ian, and thank you for your support. Good morning.
Oh, you know what? Every time I see you on my sites, it's like I'm in baseball royalty. So here's the question. Oh, come on! Every time, you even like my musical posts and my.
Yes, I do. I love them.
I get a lot of say, "Hey, Ian, that's great." Yeah, I think I don't throw my mug out there. My mug is too, I mean, even I don't even like what my mug looks like. But anyway, why has history overlooked Doc Adams?
I think it's because they didn't know. He left baseball in 1862, never went back to it, except for some backyard ball with his sons when he became a father. He never talked about it. We don't have one thing, the family does not have one thing in his handwriting that talks about baseball. He did an interview in 1896 with Sporting Life magazine. Somebody somehow found him, and they did an interview with him. And if it were not for that interview in 1896, we wouldn't know anything that we know now. We really wouldn't. It would be, that is the main source. That and an essay that my grandfather, Doc's youngest son, wrote in 1939 about his father, reminiscences. But even they don't shed a great deal of light. Doc never talked about baseball after he left it. His family was the most important thing to him, his family and his wife.
And that's interesting because I spoke to you before the show, and Doc, again, baseball in this time is in its infancies. What was Rounders? What was Town Ball?
Oh, good heavens. And you had to ask me this question.
I could explain it, but...
I don't know much about Rounders. I really don't. Town Ball was played in the round, and I think that was in Philadelphia, whereas there was the Massachusetts game that was played on the square with no foul territory, and any number of players that you wanted to have on the field, and plugging was allowed, which means you could tag a runner out by hitting him with the baseball. It's pretty vicious to me, but that was the Massachusetts game, and then there was a version in Philadelphia, and that was played in the round. I don't think that is Rounders, however, and I have lots of people I can ask. None of them are in my kitchen this morning.
Yeah, I understand that, but
I have enough trouble remembering all the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s stuff.
That's true. Now, let me ask you something. His real name was Daniel Lucius.
Yep.
How did he get the name Doc, besides him going to medical school later on? He graduated, I think, from Yale, and then went to Harvard Medical School.
Yes, he did. He was a practicing physician in New York. And I just figure that's what they gave him. That's the nickname they gave him. It fit. He practiced medicine in New York until 1864. 65, roundabout in there, and he retired from medicine when they moved to Ridgefield, Connecticut in 1865. And he never practiced it again. In fact, I think he dropped the doctor. He didn't consider himself a physician after he retired. Because we have a letter written to Doc from Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the father of the famous Supreme Court judge. Doc and Oliver Wendell Holmes shared the same boarding house for about a year when they were both at Harvard Medical School. And in about 1898, I have 2 letters written to Doc from Oliver Wendell Holmes. And one of the letters starts, "My dear doctor, once a doctor, always a doctor." So I think Doc had dropped that title once he retired from medicine, because he became the bank president.
That's right, he did.
Among other things.
Well, let me ask you this question. Doc had a musical talent to you. And let's talk about
he did.
that. Let's talk
he
about
sure
that.
Did. Our first reference to it is a letter Doc received from his father when he was at Yale. And his father is telling him he must resign from the musical society because Doc's grades were not what his father wanted them to be, and said that the musical society was taking up way too much of his time. Beyond that, I always grew up knowing that Doc used to play the flute. And he played flute duets, according to the family, with Henry Ward Beecher, who was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame. They had first met when Doc and Beecher were at Amherst College. That's where Doc started his college education. He then later transferred to Yale. But that's where they met. And so somewhere in that time frame, which would be about 1833 to 1835, Doc began to play the flute. And he played it all his life. My understanding is, though, that Henry Ward Beecher was head of the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, New York, and in the 1850s there was a great religious revival. It was a congregational church, and Doc was raised a Congregationalist. And it's possible they renewed their friendship in the 1850s. And that was when they did the flute duets. I do have a letter from my grandfather on another subject that mentions Doc and a man named Walter Avery playing flute duets in New York. Now, Walter Avery was a teammate of Doc's and also a cousin to Doc's wife. And they played flute duets together into the 1880s, early 1890s. So that's where the music comes in. He never talked about that either. He was not a talkative man. He did not believe in self-promotion.
And let me ask you this. He didn't have any, because in those days people kept diaries and stuff. There's so little we understand about Doc, and I still got the information you gave me a couple of years ago. And we're talking about a very bright man who has been on the cusp of a few things here. Number one, solidifying baseball's early history. Two, the congressional, because he had a congressional upbringing, in Massachusetts and later
in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire, excuse me, that's right.
Yeah, that's okay.
And then later
Sorry.
on, president of a bank, and raising his family. Normally, men of his stature and his intelligence kept diaries and logs. I know there was a few papers sold a few years ago for like $3 million, but that's pretty much all we have. Why do you think Doc didn't keep his memoirs?
I cannot tell you, and if they ever existed, they are now gone. I never heard of any. I will tell you that when Doc's son, my grandfather, when he died in 1962, they were living in Buffalo, New York, and my parents went up to Buffalo and started to clean out the house, only to discover that my father's older brother, who lived in Buffalo, had been cleaning out the house for 6 months. And all sorts of family things had been tossed in the trash, my uncle believing that nobody cared. Well, my parents were not happy. Not happy at all. So we do not know what got thrown out. So we are lucky to have what we have. I have transcribed by my great aunt, Doc's eldest daughter, about 150 letters and journals and diaries written by Doc's father. The letters were all to Doc, starting in 1827 when Doc was shipped off to boarding school at the age of 13, up to when his father died in 1864. And among those letters is one written by Doc. Why it got saved, I don't know, because it's not the least bit exciting. It was written in about 1854. Doc, he was a volunteer physician with the New York Infirmary, treating the poor, as well as having his own medical practice. And he was often called upon to help out during the cholera epidemics. And this one letter that we have, he talks about being called out to treat people during the latest cholera epidemic. It was in July when this letter was written. So, while we have so little of Doc first person, these letters that his father wrote him are very telling in understanding the man that Doc became. He had a very strict New England upbringing, a very strict religious upbringing, and that permeates the letters. And with that strict Puritan religious upbringing, it was not in the DNA to puff yourself up, to promote, or to brag. It is just not in the DNA. It wasn't in the DNA then or now. So you can learn a lot about Doc from reading those letters, even if we don't have a first-hand account.
Now, let me ask you this. He came to New York in 1839. He was playing some form of bat and ball as early as 1832 in New Hampshire. We know through your wonderful website, and I implore everyone to go there.
Thank you.
Doc
and sign our petition to get Doc into the Hall. We have an online petition to get Doc in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, you can go there and do and sign the petition. Actually, I signed the guest book yesterday.
I saw that.
Yeah, I haven't been on in a while, and I like what you did with the site. It's a lot different than when I last remember.
Well, I cannot take credit for that. I will tell you that I have a friend by the name of Roger Ratzenberger, and he does our website, and then I'll send him an email and whine and complain about something, and an hour later he fixed it. He's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, you know what shocks me more than anything? Two things I've learned this year, which one of them I knew to be true. The game of baseball, through my show with Professor Deborah Shattuck, was originally formed with unisex, both sexes in mind, okay? Now,
yes.
This game of baseball that you so mentioned in your biography of Doc on the website says, look, this game around 1839, 1840 was played by young lawyers, doctors, merchants, bank clerks, and others who could leave New York because they had the means to do it. Now, my question to you is, they played it for exercise. What else did they play it for if they're going to leave New York?
It was for fun. It was for health reasons. Sports there's always been an element to sports of doing it for fun, for leisure, and for health reasons. And when you're cooped up in a city, you don't have many opportunities for a pursuit like that. And so that was a large part of it. They were young men with a lot of energy to burn. So that was a large part of it. For camaraderie, probably some male ego, you can throw some of that in there. There's always that element. Does that answer your question?
Oh, it does. My thing is, I just want to know if in the letters or in the thing, if women were included on this besides...
Oh, no. No.
Oh, huh?
No. I think originally I would imagine not a lot of people came to watch, because really there wasn't much to watch in the early years. It was only as the game gained popularity that women would start to attend. And that brings up another subject. There were very strict rules of decorum with Doc's club, and swearing was not allowed, and you could get fined for swearing. And that became all the more important when the ladies started to attend. So there was that element as well. But eventually, yes, the women got interested in it as well. I know that in John Thorne's book, Baseball in the Garden of Eden, which if your listeners have not read it, they should, there's a photograph in there of a women's baseball team at Vassar College in the late 1860s. I don't remember the date, but it's late 1860s. And it's amazing to me that in really such a relatively short period of time that the game was spreading that quickly to colleges and to women. I find that fascinating. In fact, you mentioned Deborah Shattuck, and I've been wanting to read her book. And I will. I'll get to it someday, because I know she's just written a book on the subject of women in baseball.
She did. I had a podcast with her. and it goes back to that. And then, we did talk about Vassar College, where the origins of women's baseball, most of this stuff. And, I also did a podcast with Ed Acorn, who's the chief editor of the sports section.
I know Ed.
Yeah, Ed, and I got to go see him because he has to give me his first book he wrote. But with Ed and Ed's book, we learned the whole 1880s was this backlash. Not only Jim Crow with the former slaves and this whole thing against, blacks in America, but women as well. And this is where women start to get shut out of baseball. Blacks got to get shut out of baseball. The whitening of America was really pretty much jump-started when the North left the South after Reconstruction, because, of course, the North pillaged the South. A lot of people don't realize that, the South was privy to what was called scalawags and carpetbaggers and all these guys. They went down, and now they had to exact revenge on the North. And the way they did it was, like a few months ago, everyone's crying about Confederate war statues and all this. Well, they were put up, not so much in glorifying these guys, but to understand that, look, you might have beaten us, but our theology is still here. Now, let's go back to Doc, okay? Because this is 40 years before, and of course Doc was still living in the 1880s. I'm really sorry that we don't have all this information, because he probably would have been appalled to learn that baseball became gamblers, drunks, people who cheated on their wives. It became a scandalous game, just like boxing was.
And that may be why he never commented on it. Maybe he was so disappointed in the direction it was going that, I know he played backyard ball with his two sons, but I don't know if he followed any scores, anything like that. I have no idea.
Yeah, and let me ask you something. Is there a record somewhere how Doc met up with Alexander Cartwright?
No, I would imagine, as I understand it, and I have to do more research on this, the official founding of the club Doc belonged to, the Knickerbocker Baseball Club, was officially founded in September of 1845. But as I understand it, the club had been around for several years prior to that, but it was fairly informal. I do not believe that Doc was playing with them then, because in the 1896 interview in Sporting News, he clearly says in there, talking about the founding of the Knickerbockers, September 23rd of 1845, and he joined about a month later. I do believe he was playing with the New York Baseball Club prior to that. And again, I have to do more research. But that's what I have been told by people who are way farther up the historical research food chain than I am. I just haven't seen the evidence myself. So that's something I have to do.
And let me ask you this. Did you see the papers that were sold a few years ago?
Yes, I did.
And what does that contain? What did that contain?
That was one of the most, really one of the top 10 moments of my life. It was the Doc's handwritten 1857 Laws of Baseball. And it was January of last year. I got an email from someone who I trust, who said, you're going to get an email from this person. Open it. And when the email came about an hour later, I did. And long story short, because the confidentiality agreement I signed is still in effect, I went to an undisclosed location in an undisclosed state, walked into a conference room, and spread out on the table were 3 pages of Doc's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. And that was the original. It was actually there right in front of me. I still get chills when I think about it. And I think I cried. I really do. Because we didn't own it. The family didn't own it. We certainly didn't buy it. If we had owned it, we wouldn't have sold it because it's family. We would have put it on display for the world to see, but we never would have sold it. In any case, that was a revelation. And it really was the first person account that had it come out, had it been presented to the world 1 year prior, Doc probably would have gotten in the Hall of Fame in 2015. Because right there it says 90 is his calculation, 90 feet between bases. Up to that point it was 42 paces between the bases. And in the Sporting News interview of 1896, Doc says after careful study, he made the bases 90 feet and 45 feet from pitcher's base to home plate. And that 90 feet was pivotal. Those who have seen the Ken Burns documentary on baseball, there's a baseball writer in there, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, who says whoever did the 90 feet between bases was a genius, because 89 feet would have been too short and 91 feet would have been too long. And when I first saw the Ken Burns documentary 20 years ago, I didn't know any of this Doc Adams stuff, none of it. And I was thinking, oh, isn't that interesting, only to find out 20 years later that it was Doc who had done the 90 feet. So that's in there. Might also interest your listeners to know that also in there is no gambling by anybody involved in the game. Not a player, not a manager, not an umpire, no wagering. Clear as day. So that goes back to 1857. So anyway, I saw the 3 pages, and then, of course, they were put up for auction and sold in April of last year for $3.26 million. Highest paid for any baseball document. Third highest paid for any sports memorabilia. Second only to James Naismith's Rules of Basketball, and that was topped by a Babe Ruth uniform from the 1820s that went for more than that. So that's pretty exciting, and it was nice that the new owner of the Laws of Baseball put them on display at the Oregon Historical Society. And the exhibit was so well received that it went, I think they extended it about a month. So a lot of people got to see it, and I really do hope that someday the new owner will bring them to New York to put them on display, because really New York City is the birthplace of our modern game. And I know there are lots of people in New York City who would like to see those laws. So if the new owner is listening, that's what I'd like to see.
You know, Marjorie, that is so amazing. And the folks at home are going to listening to that and listen to it closely, because that's how much Doc is important to the game. Now let's go and add on to this legend that Doc created, which again, if he was around, he'd probably say, hey, I don't take credit for all this stuff. He played in the first baseball game, what was considered the first game, in Hoboken, New Jersey, the Ellison Field there. And, of course, the Knickerbockers, if you do your work, they lost 22-1. And Doc, I think, didn't have any...
He made 3 outs.
Yeah.
But there was a man named Davis on the opposing New York club who was fined 6 cents for swearing.
And in those days, 6 cents was a lot. But this is the thing that fascinates me. Doc joined a month after the team was formulated, around September 23rd, 24th. How did he get elevated to vice president of the club in such a short time?
He probably knew, I'm sure many of the other members knew him, because a lot of them had come from the New York Baseball Club. So there was a Knickerbocker club of sorts that had been playing for about 2 years before they formally organized. There was also the New York Baseball Club, and I believe Doc was playing with them. And a lot of those members left the New York club and joined the Knickerbockers. So he obviously had some sort of good reputation with the New York club that he was proposed and accepted as a member of the Knickerbockers. And then, obviously, he had leadership skills that showed and a good reputation. And in April of 1846, he was elected vice president of the club. And the following year, he was elected president of the club. So I think they knew him. I think some of the members from the New York Baseball Club knew him.
And what's more amazing of this fact was that during those 5 years, it was very difficult for Doc. And as captain of the team, this guy had to get attendance in there. The players weren't all for it like he was. But what do you think kept him going besides the love of the game? Why do you think, in your research of Doc, and of course we're not going to have that answer, that he wanted to make this a game that will have longevity in American culture?
I think, and I can only go by what others have told me. About 20 years ago, I met a very nice man by the name of Fred Ivor Campbell, a wonderful baseball researcher, and anyone who has studied the history of the game knows that name. And when I first met him, and we didn't speak for very long, he said to me, "You know, Marjorie, Doc Adams saved baseball." I hate to say it, I think I laughed, just because the whole thing sounded so absurd to me at the time, because I really knew nothing about what Doc had done, or just very little, things I'd been told as a child. And so I asked him why. And he said, well, it was Doc who at the club dinners would urge people to come out for practice. And he was most insistent of people coming out for practice, even though for those first 5 years, they didn't have anybody to play against. So there was no competition. He was the one who at the club dinners got people to come out for practice. And I also think that, and this is my own thought, he made all the baseballs for the club, and he supervised the manufacture of all the bats, because you couldn't buy these implements anywhere. And I think that demonstrated to the members his enthusiasm and love for the game. And I think that also influenced people to come out and play. So it's twofold. I think he was a nag at the club dinners, if I could call him that. It's not very nice. I should think of another word. Insistent, let's put it that way. He was insistent at club dinners that the members come out and play. And since he made sure they had the playing implements that they needed, that demonstrated to the other members his sincerity and his love of the game.
And you know what's interesting? I mean, your website describes the fact he found a Scottish saddler who was able to show him.
Yep.
A good way to cover the balls. He strung it himself. He made the catcher's stuff, the bats, everything he did. But let's take a look at the time period here. 1846 to 1848, we had the Mexican War going on. In addition, the Industrial Revolution was taking place in America, and there was no laws, and so people were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and what is then on Sunday? Church. So you don't have enough time or enough patience or enough stamina for baseball. You also have what's called manifest destiny, a look towards expanding westward.
Yes.
And you know, and Cartwright was on that. He went out to California.
Well, that was for the gold rush of 1849. He left New York in 1849 and never came back to New York.
Right, and so Cartwright, and this is that 5-year period where Doc is trying to get to, baseball up and running. And the gold rush was there, and Manifest Destiny was there, and you had a president in office under James Knox Polk who was probably one of our best one-term presidents we've ever had. He expanded the lands. he won a war in Mexico, which, again, depending upon where you were in the country, was a popular war, especially in the South. In the North, you still had cries of abolitionists up here. The landscape was changing. The whole thing, New York City was changing with the rapid immigration of the Irish coming in from the potato famine going on, and the Germans as well. And so you have those kind of guys which will be playing the game. And there's a very good book by David Fleitz, and I had him on my show the other day with his other book about the 19th century ethnicity of baseball. But he wrote a book, and I'm going to discuss next month, the Irish in baseball. And they took to the game, just like blacks took to the game. Now, for Doc here, there was no position of a shortstop here. So in addition, none. So in addition to talking about putting his foot forward for the game, being vice president of the Knickerbockers, and doing stringing the balls, doing the bats, being the public affairs person for the team, trying to get this instituted, Derek Jeter, Nomar Garciaparra, Alex Rodriguez, and every person, Phil Rizzuto, Pee Wee Reese, I'll go back in time, everyone who plays that
Honus Wagner,
Leo DeRocha, could throw them all
Ozzie Smith, Cal Ripken Jr.
Yeah, all of them.
Aren't you impressed? I know some of these names now.
You've been doing your research, and you learn something. You learn so much stuff on the websites and your own research that. It becomes, because you know why? Because it all stems back to Doc.
Yes.
Doc was the one. And that's why shortstop is very important to you, because, Doc basically created the game. Do we have any evidence why? I mean, Doc played first, second, and third in my recounts of talking to you. Why was the position of shortstop created?
The balls that Doc made were very light, so you could bat them quite a distance, but you couldn't throw them very far. And because they were handmade balls, they might start out at the beginning of the game at a decent rate, but after several bats, the ball got lighter and spongier as the game went on. So it could get batted a distance, it couldn't get thrown very far. So the shortstop position began as a relay position, to bring balls back in from the outfield, bring them back into the bases. So it was an intermediary position. And as the equipment got better, that's when the position moved into where we know it is, to where it is today. So it was still a very pivotal position back then, because it was the only way you could get people out on bases, was to get the ball back into the infield. So it was very critical. It was also his favorite. I do know it was his favorite position. And he did play all positions except pitcher.
And you know something, Marjorie? With the creation of shortstop, it changed the face of the game. You can always tell shortstop is the hardest in the infield to play. Third base, you got pretty much a square throw to first. Shortstop, you got probably the longest throw to first. Of course, second base is there, and again, first base. You got to be athletic to catch those balls that are grounded to you, but basically, you're sitting there waiting for the ball. But my question is this. Doc was more instrumental serving as the executive. He was the president for 6 times, 47, 48, 49, 56, 57, 61. He made these rules. He put in the lines, the pitcher mound, everything. We have evidence of the bylaws of 1848, and then they had their annual meeting around 1854, 1855, and then 1856 came. There were now 12 teams in New York and Brooklyn, and now they wanted to. There was a convention, and Doc was the presiding officer. And one of the resolutions passed was the 9 players.
That's right. Well, I think in all fairness, in all fairness, there's a lot to indicate that 9 players was pretty much at that point the norm. And that was into the 1850s. So they just codified it. A lot of the rules that got written down in 1857 was just that, written down. They were rules that most of the clubs were playing by and had agreed to, but this put it in writing. But we do know that it was the Knickerbockers. There were two factions on the Knickerbockers. One faction wanted 7 players, 7 innings. Another faction wanted 9 and 9. And long story short, Doc ended up on the committee. He was an advocate for 9 men, 9 innings. So that's why he wrote it in the rules, even though there was a faction. And it did get debated at the convention for 7 men, 7 innings. And at the very end, one of Doc's teammates cast a deciding vote for 9 men, 9 innings. He was originally 7 for the 7, but he changed his mind at the end, this other player. So, and that's true with a lot of these lists of laws that you see. They leave a lot of things out because they were things that everybody had agreed to. So often the laws that are written down are the things that they didn't agree to, and now they were finally agreeing to them. I think that's what's so interesting about it.
But the thing is, Doc, he gave the bases at 30 yards apart.
Yep.
He did the home to pitches base 45 feet.
Yes.
Foul balls, fly pop-ups. He defined 3 outs, 9 innings, 9 players.
Yes.
And then when it all came together, the Civil War was going on in 1862, but Doc decided to leave it. Why did Doc decide to leave it? I know he got married, and he was a year older than me at this time. I'm 47, so Doc was around my age when he dropped out of baseball. What was going on?
Yes. Doc got married in 1861. He was 47 years old. His wife was 17 years his junior. And as near as I can tell from this correspondence from his father, in early March of 1862, there is a letter from his father saying, implying very strongly that Doc's wife was pregnant. It was the Victorian age. They didn't use those words. They said everything but. But that's certainly what one can infer from this letter. And then 2 weeks after this letter, Doc resigns from the Knickerbockers. And until I examined these letters, I didn't know why. I didn't know about the pregnancy and all that. Because just about 3 weeks after he resigned, there's another letter from his father, and it is very clear that his wife has lost the baby. She's had a miscarriage. And she did not regain her health until September of 1862. So I think what happened to Doc was that background of his, the religion, the family, all that Puritan upbringing, finally made itself known, and he decided being a good husband and a good father was more important than the game. Keep in mind, and this is very important, since this was not professional, this game, it was amateur, nobody was paid, this was just for fun. And if you come from a Puritan background, they don't believe in a lot of fun, those Puritans. They never did. So Doc decided that his wife and having a family was more of a priority than this leisurely pursuit. And that's how he saw baseball, as a leisurely pursuit. He loved it, but it was still for leisure and for pleasure. And that's why he quit the game. For his wife.
Yeah, and it's funny because he said, my marriage was the crowning achievement of my life. Now,
yes, he wrote that in 1888 in a Yale alumni publication. And in that little autobiography that he had to write for Yale, there's not one mention of baseball. Not one. None.
Why do you suppose Doc was so quiet on the game, especially now we're in the 1880s and baseball has pretty much solidified, America's pastimes, crowning achievement here?
I just think it wasn't important enough to him. It was leisurely. It was for fun. I'm sure he was glad that it had grown the way it did. He might not have approved of a lot of the behaviors, but I'm sure he was pleased that people were still playing the game. But it was not the focal point of his life. It's that Puritan upbringing. Pleasure and fun always comes last. When you're a Puritan, everything else comes first.
Yeah.
So, again, it would not have been in Doc's DNA to promote himself. And I am astonished, and I would love to know, and someday I will, when I meet Doc, I will find out how the Sporting News interview came to be. How did the reporter find him? Now, I'm just dying to know that end of the story.
Yeah, because he moved to New Haven and little is known about, but he also was an umpire. I mean, this is so incredible. A player, executive, promoter, and umpire, and he also produced a rule, hey, it's a strike even if you don't swing at it. These are integral rules. Now, what's more fascinating about this, again, his wife is 17 years his junior. He died in 1899, and she passed on 3 years later. How'd both of them pass on?
He had pneumonia. He'd been suffering from it for 3 days. He was in his late 80s. She, I think, had health issues all her life. There are vague references to that in family correspondence. She did have that miscarriage in 1862. They had another child in 1864 who only lived 2 months, 1 month, 2 months. And so she had her health issues as well. They did go on to have 4 children. The youngest was my grandfather. Doc was 60 when my grandfather was born.
Oh, gee, God bless him.
Yeah. God bless her. She was in her 40s.
Yeah, she was 43,
Yeah.
I mean, I was 37 when I had my kids. Now at 47, I'm like, I couldn't even fathom. A lot of my friends are grandparents. Let me ask you this question. When's Doc up again for the Hall of Fame?
2020 will be the next ballot.
And let me ask you something. With the support, and I know Hal Bach just wrote an article about him. We have a lot of people plugging for Doc. More, like we mentioned earlier in the show, the letters sold, but probably if that was done before the balloting in 2015, that might have just pushed the writers to see the importance of Docs. Is there anything that I left out in my inquiry here that maybe you would want to share with the folks listening to the program?
No, except that if they really want to understand Doc, I'm not sure Doc would even approve of what I'm doing, of pushing to get him in the Hall. I'm not sure he'd approve of it. And so sometimes I'm a little conflicted about it. But I'm going to continue because it's the right thing to do. And I think of the Hall of Fame that the first line of their motto is preserving history. And Doc deserves that recognition as part of the history of the game. So that's why I keep going.
And you know something? You always have my support. I know.
Thank you, Ian.
I know you have my network, the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with Ralph Tycho, and I know Hal Bach got in touch with you through me. And
yes, he did. He wrote a very nice article.
Yeah, and the problem that I have is there's just not a lot of information on Doc to create a coherent biography of Doc, which would really help his chances with not only people understanding the truth of who invented the game, but to show Major League Baseball that this was the true story. This is the evidence that were produced, and we would close up and make an airtight case for anyone who wanted to challenge this. They'd really have to produce substantial evidence to overturn this, because from what I've understood, what I've researched and looking at the stuff, and I've done a lot of it, we have to credit Doc Adams as being the father of modern baseball. And again, Alexander sits in the Hall of Fame in 1938, and Doc, almost 80 years later, we're pushing to get him in. So what I want my listeners to do, I want you to go to the website, docadamsbaseball.com. I want you to look
.org. Baseball.org.
.org. Me and these dots. So .org. I want you to look around. I want you to educate yourself, and I want you to sign the petition to get Doc Adams into the Hall of Fame. He is probably the single most overlooked person in the 19th century that had, you could say impact, but I'd rather say, he started all this. And you got to give credit to a man who had changed history, because baseball in America is history. If Babe Ruth changed the sport in the 1920s with the Powerball and the live ball era, and Jackie Robinson changed not only baseball, but America, because Dr. King once said, hey, I wasn't the one who started the civil rights movement. It was Jackie Robinson. Then Doc Adams, in the infancy of baseball, should be the father of baseball. And like Marjorie said, we don't know if he would approve it. He was a very humble guy, and he was a congressionalist, and again, being a Puritan, you don't languish over credit or fun or leisure. You do what is necessary to do. Like my in-laws, they're from old Italy. They're in the yard 8 hours a day doing their chores or whatever in their farm, and cleaning the house and cooking, even for all 6 kids that are in their 50s and 40s, and for their grandchildren who I bring over, and that's what Puritans did. So, folks, remember, Doc Adams, go to the site, sign the petition. Thank you, Marjorie, for being on the show. Hold the line.
Thank you, Ian, so much. This was fun. I appreciate your support.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Hold the line. Let me end the show, and then I'll talk to you.
I will.
For about a minute. Folks, go to the website. Get educated on Doc Adams. It is such a necessary thing to understand about Doc, what he did, and why the game is the game, from the rules he instituted to the fact that he lobbied for the game, that he created the game for exercise, and that he pretty much, along with the Knickerbockers and Cartwright, were literally the founders and the pioneers of what we know of baseball. Folks, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Marjorie. And for the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Band, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.